Good evening. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. I'm here to introduce the introducer, and we're honored to have two wonderful guests. And on the faculty here is Professor Ash Carter, who's chair of the International Global Affairs faculty of the Kennedy School. He's also co-director with former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry of the Preventive Defense Project, a research collaboration between Harvard and Stanford. Former Assistant Secretary of Defense, Dr. Carter is a graduate of Yale University with an academic background in medieval history as well as physics, and he holds a doctorate degree from Oxford University where he was a Rhodes Scholar. We're honored to have us represent us at the Kennedy School. Dr. Carter.
Thank you. And let me thank both Jim Leach and Graham Allison here for giving me the privilege of introducing our guest tonight, because he's a friend of mine and someone I admire very greatly. Nick Burns stepped down just a few weeks ago, February 29th, as Undersecretary for Political Affairs in the State Department. And for those of you who don't know what that means, it is the pinnacle of the diplomatic service of the United States of America. It is the third-ranking position in the State Department, and it has a portfolio as wide as planet Earth. So Nick's hands were in everything, and I think it's fair to say that his reputation around the government and around the world is as the go-to person in this era of this administration if you want consistency and delivery from the United States government. He's the one who can consistently give the message that is the true message of the President of the United States on foreign policy and can deliver on that message. This job for Nick is the capstone of one of the most meteoric rises in Foreign Service history. Before this job, he was NATO ambassador. He was ambassador to Greece. He was, and this may be one way you recognize Nick, State Department spokesman. So he's the face on the TV all the time in the 1990s. Senior director for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, and the National Security Council. And that's where I first got to know him, and Graham also, working with him. He was hired by Brent Scowcroft. Now, Brent Scowcroft is a great talent scout. And Brent hired, in addition to Nick, Condi Rice, Bob Blackwell, Philip Zelikow, a lot of very talented people. Brent always had a line. He said, I hire always people who are smarter than I. And our little joke to him used to be, well, how do you narrow it down? He hired smart people, and he hired Nick. And that's when I first got to know him. Now, I'm going to tell you, are we off the record here? I tell a little secret, which is I was part of the early Clinton administration. And the little secret is, and I don't want to shock anybody in here, but new administrations don't really know what they're doing. And Nick Burns was one of these people who, in the continuity from the first Bush administration to the Clinton administration, taught the new team what's what. Assured foreigners that this change of American presidents wasn't going to derail everything they had known and come to know to associate with the United States policy. These people will settle down too and come to their senses. Nick was part of that continuity, and by the way, I was hoping would be continuity into the next administration, but that's another story because I think the nation needs it. Everything he does is thoughtful, serious. I think you'll learn that tonight. I ran into a quote from a high school classmate of Nick's. And he said, when he, Nick, ran for class president in high school, he would bring in all these world issues to his campaign speeches, while all the other candidates were arguing for better food in the cafeteria and less homework. Another thing that's been written of Nick, the following quote: perhaps the only thing Schultz, Christopher, Berger, Rice, Powell, Clinton, and two George Bushes have in common is that they've all trusted Nicholas Burns. One entry in his bio, Nick, I think in your bio, has confounded foreign intelligence services around the world. And you can imagine, you can hear him talking to us, and they say sort of something like, what it mean, comrade, member of Red Sox Nation. Nick is a member of Red Sox Nation, proud Bostonian, and for that reason, we're also delighted to have him back. He could talk about just about anything. I remind you that he's still a member of the, even though he's out of the job he was in, a member of the U.S. administration, but he can talk about many topics. We asked him tonight to talk about Iran. Iran's probably the biggie that's going to immediately come on the radar screen of the next American administration. It's possible that this administration will deal or attempt to deal with it in some way in the remaining months. But why is Iran a problem? Let me count the ways. There's the nuclear problem. There's the meddling just about everywhere in the Middle East. There's the strident rhetoric. There is the almost amoeba-like quality of the government itself, where you can't quite get a handle on it, and it's here, and then it's here, and then it oozes over here. It's worse than us in terms of being able to predict where policy's gonna come out. So let him start there, but in your questions, you can take him anywhere, because as I said, he's a man for all seasons, man for all parts of the world, and until just a few weeks ago, responsible for formulating policies for all parts of the world. Nick, it's a real pleasure to have you back at the Kennedy School, and an honor to listen to you and to be your friend and to be a fellow member of Red Sox Nation.
Thanks, Ash. Thank you very, very much. Ash, thank you very, very much. If my parents were here, my mother would be very, very proud. My father would believe about a tenth of what you said. But it's a pleasure to be here back at the Kennedy School, where I've been coming off and on for the last decade, usually at the invitation of my friend Graham Allison, to talk to students and to faculty. And as Ash said, I've just left exactly 9 days ago my job as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. It was a great job because it did span the globe. I had responsibility for overseeing our foreign policy and really the daily management of that policy in every part of the world, in every geographic region of the world. And I thought before I said a few words about Iran, and before we get to a conversation, I wanted to say a few words about American foreign policy and what we're facing as a country, because I think, and I'm looking out at all these people, a lot of whom have served with me in administrations past, including Larry Summers and Ash Carter and Graham Allison. I think America's at a key point in our history, in the way we relate to the rest of the world. I think the rest of the world feels it's at a key point in a key juncture in the evolution of how Americans think about our role in the world. Whether it's George Bush between now and January 20th, 2009, or the next president, whoever that person may be, there is a daunting array of challenges that we face as a people overseas. Survey the landscape. I think the most critical issues of our time are all multilateral. I think the common denominator of the 5 or 10 most important issues is they're all largely going to be immune to a unilateral foreign policy or to an isolationist foreign policy, and I wanted to start there. In our 230-odd years as a country, we have swung wildly back and forth between bursts of engagement in the world and periods of real isolation from it, shrinking from the problems of the world. And you all know that because you know our diplomatic history. I think right now we're at a juncture where we can no longer afford such wild swings in the way we relate to the rest of the world, because my list of top 5 challenges would be global climate change, trafficking of women and children, which is a global scourge, international drug cartels, international crime cartels, and the growth of worldwide terrorist groups that have the capacity to strike us all over the world, and the juxtaposition of that threat with chemical, biological, and nuclear technology, an issue that Graham has done a lot of work on. Now that's just 5 issues. If we got together, we could come up with another 10 or 15 whose common denominator would be they're global. And so therefore, to be successful on any one of them, we have got to think of this as a campaign, not just the United States fighting global climate change or trafficking of women and children, but the world doing it. And that means that we have to be in the world. And as a leader in the world, We have to care about the health of institutions that are critical in fighting those problems, like the United Nations. And instead of, as my former colleague John Bolton used to say, he said, let's take 10 stories off UN headquarters in New York. We've got to rebuild literally that headquarters and figuratively as well. And I think that represents the greatest change for our country as a global leader. Because if we want to lead, the agenda can't just be the American agenda. The agenda has to be the world's agenda. And in many parts of the world, particularly Europe, where I travel quite frequently, global climate change in the hearts and passions of the people who live there is the greatest challenge. And so the United States has to be front and center in participating in combating that challenge on a multilateral basis. And I do think the Bush administration, particularly in the second term, has come back to multilateralism as an organizing principle for American power in the world and for American purpose in the world. And I wanted to start there as one of the great transforming events of our time. Think of another issue that is in all the publications, in all the literature, the rise of China and India. Two countries that are going to play, as global leaders, a decisive role in world politics in the generation and two ahead. We have an opportunity there which is largely positive. I think the Bush administration, as well as the Clinton administration, have engineered a relatively successful policy towards beginning to engage China to think of itself, as Bob Zellick, a graduate of this school, said so correctly back in 2005, as a global stakeholder. And that really is the opportunity with China. We're going to have our differences on religious rights, on human rights, on intellectual property rights, but can we convince China that they're part of that virtual governing global board of the world that does exist, really? And China needs to think of itself as part of the answer in Darfur, and on Iran, and on Burma, and on North Korea. And the challenge with India, a very definitely rising India, is that the soon-to-be largest country in the world by population, India will overtake China in population in the next decade, a country that has, in essence, 1 foot in the non-aligned camp, the 60-year tradition of Indian foreign policy, but interestingly, 1 foot in the global leadership camp. That country, as the largest democracy in the world, could become, I would wager, in the next 50 years, one of our 2 or 3 most important strategic partners in the world, because it is a democracy. It does have an evolutionary and, I think, emerging sense of itself as a global power that wants to spread democracy, that wants to use the power of the Indian state pretty much for what the United States wants to do in terms of supporting liberal capitalism, supporting democratic thought, supporting human rights, and supporting stability right now in one of the most dangerous parts of the world, its region of South Asia. So I look at the rise of India and China as playing to our strengths and advantages, and I think it's something that this administration, as well as the next, need to take advantage of. Think of another transforming event that affects all Americans. The emergence of energy is a dynamic and sometimes dominant issue in international politics. If I were giving this talk in 1998 or 1988 or 78 versus 2008, I wouldn't have listed energy as one of the defining challenges for Americans, but it certainly is. Everything from the impact that the price of oil and gas are having on our economy and way of life, to climate change itself, to the distorting impact that energy power is giving Russia on the world stage, and Iran on the world stage, and Burma and Venezuela, just to name 4 countries. And I think of something else. I think of the work as a transforming issue in our foreign policy that Joe Nye has done on soft power and smart power. And I try to think of our strengths and weaknesses as a country and how we interact with the rest of the world. We're very good at hard power. We have a military that by any metric is the dominant military in the world, and we're very proud of that military and of the people in it. But foreign and defense policy is a function not just of the harder edge of our society and government and our power. It's a function of the strength of our society, of our corporate sector, of our NGO sector, of our people, and of our universities especially. And marshaling that power and combining it with our hard power is the real challenge on every issue we face. And I think Joe has done a really fine job in demonstrating that that aspect of our foreign policy has been underfunded, and that we need to put more effort and give it into it and give it more attention and think of it as part of our national strategy. Let me give you one example from my own immediate past, the State Department. We're a relatively small cabinet agency. We have 6,500 diplomats. That's it. We're the size of two relatively modestly armed brigades in the United States military. There are more musicians in the Department of Defense, in the four services, than there are American diplomats in the world. And we find ourselves, particularly in the second term of President Bush's time in office, having prosecuted two wars, two military interventions in the first term, now holding the responsibility for refugee assistance in those places, humanitarian assistance, rebuilding the civic life of the countries, rule of law programs. Those are civilian functions. Who did them in Afghanistan? When we defeated the Taliban in late November of 2001, the military did. Who did those in Iraq in the immediate wake of the fighting in the spring and summer of 2003? The military, because we did not have the capacity in the civilian part of the government. We didn't have the resources. We didn't have trained people. We didn't have any kind of reserve concept to reach into civilian life to say to people, can you go to Iraq or Afghanistan for 2 months as an electricity specialist or a water specialist or a governance specialist? And fortunately, Senator Lugar and Senator Biden said at the State Department in 2004, you need to develop this capacity and the Congress will help you. And the Congress has come through with funding, and we're in the process of building it. But it does showcase in all these interventions over the last 10 or 15 years, Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Afghanistan, and Iraq, that a successful foreign policy cannot be left just to the military alone. So marshaling our soft power, and particularly the civilian side of our government, is going to be very important. The last transformative shift that I think about when I think about our foreign policy is the shift in strategic direction. And the way I think about it is, as someone who majored in European history at Boston College nearby, is that we were Euro-focused by necessity, really from the First World War, when Woodrow Wilson went up to the Congress in April 1917 and said, we need 2 million American men at that time to fight and make the decisive difference, as they did, in the First World War. And from that time on, all the way through the rise of fascism, the prosecution of the Second World War, the Cold War, the 4 Balkan Wars, the end of communism, the fall of the Berlin Wall, we were a global power, we were active everywhere, but our vital national security focus was on Europe. And what's changed very appreciably in Washington over the last decade is that that's no longer the case, and happily so, given the success of several generations of our foreign policy in Europe. The 21st century version of Europe as focal point is now the Middle East for the United States, and it will be, I think, for the rest of our lifetimes. It's the Middle East, and it's the fires and challenges there, and South Asia, and East Asia, in terms of the vital challenges that could undo our way of life, that could threaten the existence of our country, that could threaten our vital national interests as they're arrayed around the globe. That's not to say that what we're doing in Africa with our $30 billion HIV/AIDS program, or our malaria initiative, or the creation of our strategic relationships with Nigeria and South Africa aren't important. They are very important initiatives, as is the necessity for a renewed engagement in our hemisphere. But our European policy has become a function of our global policy. It is very much reoriented. And what really is going to matter as we debate these issues in the run-up to our elections and for the next president will be these interlocking crises in the Middle East. And that brings us to Iran. It brings us to our commitment to Iraq, to the Lebanon crisis, to the continued absence of an Israeli-Palestinian peace, now nearly 60 years this coming May 14th, after 2 events, epical events in the history of the Middle East, the creation of the State of Israel on May 14th, 1948, and the dispersal of the Palestinians, and the impact that both of those events have had in bringing instability, war, chaos, societal dislocation, and frankly, a lack of hope to much of the modern Middle East today. And so whether it's the remaining time in office for President Bush or the election of our new leader and the assumption of office of that person, these 4 crises in the Middle East, I think, will be front and center. And Iran will certainly be, without any question. We were talking this morning, when the new National Security Advisor walks into the new president's office shortly after inauguration to present the list of issues that need to be attended to immediately and urgently, Iran's going to be in the top 2 or 3 issues on that list. And why is that? Well, first of all, because Iran is in the Middle East. And Iran is no longer a messianic power in the Middle East as it was in the early days of the revolution under the Ayatollah Khomeini, but it's certainly a growing conventional power and certainly an opportunistic power. And here's the issue for the United States as we think about Iran. Iran is the leading supporter of all of the groups that are opposing violently American policy in the Middle East. Think about that for a moment. Iran is funding and arming Hamas in Gaza against the moderate Palestinians, against Fatah, against Abu Mazen. Iran was the creator of Hezbollah in 1982 and has been the main benefactor militarily, politically, financially of Hezbollah until the present day. Hezbollah being the single most important disruptive agent in the Middle East, certainly in Lebanon and in Syria. Iran is funding and arming the Shia militant groups that in 2006 and 2007 and until now have been the groups trying to kill American soldiers, particularly in the southern part of the country, through the provision of this sophisticated IED technology that has been so destructive to our foot patrols and to our armored patrols. Iran has begun over the last 18 months to fund and arm the Taliban in Afghanistan in a reversal of Iranian policy since the defeat of the Taliban in 2001. So everywhere you look in the Middle East, and I haven't mentioned Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the PFLP General Command, Iran is behind those groups that are trying to destabilize a democratic Lebanon, the moderate Palestinians, the Iraqi government, and the Afghan government. That is a considerable conventional challenge to the region, but also to the United States as the principal guarantor of stability in the region. That's the first problem we have with Iran. Second problem is nuclear, and you all know about it. My own view, and I think the view of everybody else that I know in our government and every other senior official of other governments that we deal with in this issue, is that Iran is seeking a nuclear weapons capability. They deny it. They say that all these efforts, as one of the largest oil and gas producers of the world, with exactly one nuclear power plant under construction, Russian provided, all these efforts, they say, are purely civil and peaceful, and nobody believes them around the world. There is alarming progress, if you read Dr. Alberde's report of 2 weeks ago, in the rate of advancement of their scientific research into enriching and reprocessing uranium at their plant at Natanz. We think, and the unclassified national intelligence estimates said in December of 2007, that they stopped their nuclear weapons program in 2003. But actually, if you're looking at how a country can develop a nuclear weapons capacity, the most important factor is not actually the weaponization, and it's not even the most difficult factor. The most difficult factor is finding fissile material and then doing something with it that can make that country nuclear capable. And that's exactly what Iran is doing by its own admission. These aren't theories and assumptions and suppositions. Just look at the statements that the Iranian government has been making to the IAEA. They say they've advanced their P1 and P2 centrifuge research. They say the Iranians are now up to about 3,000 centrifuges at that plant at Natanz. They say they want to go to 50,000 centrifuges. This is an alarm bell for anyone who wants to limit the growth of nuclear powers in the Middle East. And it's a very, very important concern of our country, of Israel, and of the moderate Arab states in the Middle East. That's the second problem in dealing with Iran. The third problem is something less empirical and something more political. It has to do with the way Iranians think of themselves and how this particular government of Ahmadinejad has characterized Iranian foreign policy. He says, and his foreign minister Mottaki says, that they want to return to the spirit of 1979 and 80, which they say was disrupted by the decade-long war with Iraq in the 1980s. That they see Iran as the most powerful future country in the Middle East. And they see Iran as a growing conventional power. And what we say in looking at that is, if Iran does achieve that kind of primacy in the Middle East, if it does, it's not a certainty, and if it becomes a nuclear weapons power, then that's a game changer in the strategic balance of power in the Middle East that is directly contrary to every interest that the United States has in now this most vital region of the world. So it's got to be a matter of national policy that we find a way to convince the Iranians to turn back from that nuclear weapons future. What it encourages me about our domestic debate, I said encourage, is that I think by and large, and I'm a nonpartisan person, career member of the Foreign Service, so I'm not saying this for political reasons, I think we do have a bipartisan consensus on the problem. And I think by and large there's a bipartisan consensus that we need to be actively engaged against this problem, in trying to resolve this problem. And I think most people would say that the proper way for the United States to proceed is to understand one important thing about time. We have some time. There is no reason that the United States has to think of this in purely military terms. We have a number of instruments at our disposal that can leverage and coerce and persuade. And a lot of them are on the diplomatic side of the equation. And so it's been our view over the last 3 years since Secretary Rice took office as Secretary of State that we ought to be focused on diplomacy. I think most everybody agrees that we shouldn't take off the table the military option as an option for the United States on an issue of this consequence and an issue concerning this particular government. But our policy has been focused, and I think rightly so, on trying to be creative diplomatically to see if there's a way to convince the Iranians to come to the negotiating table and to reason not just with the United States, but with Russia and China, Britain, France, Germany, and the United States together. So if you will, what we're trying to establish is a multilateral negotiation in the Middle East that would look something like what we've done rather successfully, but not completely successfully, in North Asia on the North Korea nuclear problem. That the states that have the most direct concerns and the most direct influence should get together with the state in question, in this case Iran, to try to see if there is a way to persuade that country to think of their future in a different way. So for 2 years now, we've tried to do that. And nearly 2 years ago, on June 1st, 2006, these 6 countries, led by Russia and the United States, offered Iran the following deal. We said, you've got 2 paths in front of you. One of them is quite positive and one of them is quite negative. Here's the positive path. We, the 6 countries, led by Russia and the United States, are willing to help you build a civil nuclear power capacity inside Iran. We know that you need electricity production for your people. All of us are civil nuclear powers. All of us are willing to form a consortium, deliver nuclear fuel, help construct nuclear power plants. We'll take back the spent fuel, by the way. We're not going to trust you, Iran, with a complete nuclear fuel cycle, but we'll help you achieve this if your intentions are what you say. You want a civil program based on electricity production. We also said that those of us who have sanctions against you, and that was really the United States, are willing to lift some of those sanctions. We're willing to engage in commerce with you that we've not done since the hostage crisis of 1979 and 80. And by the way, we're just asking you to do one thing: suspend for the life of the negotiations your nuclear research at your Planet Natanz, and we will suspend the sanctions in place against you for the life of the negotiations. So we weren't asking Iran to make a unilateral commitment that we weren't willing to make on our side as well. We thought in the spring and summer of 2006 that Iran was going to accept the negotiations. We didn't know if they'd be successful. We didn't know if they'd stop the Iranian nuclear program, but we thought they'd at least come to the table. From an American perspective, for the first time for a meaningful discussion since 1978 and 79. And that assumption turned out to be false. Iran turned down that initial offer in late June of 2006. We issued it again in 2007 through Javier Solana, the EU foreign policy chief. They turned it down again. In the spring of last year, 2007, just before the G8 summit in Germany, we actually said, look, we'll give you a 2 or 3 week window. Let's talk about that offer. And they said no. And we actually went back to them in September of 2007, just last September at the United Nations, and said, think about this again. Secretary Rice has said consistently, I will show up, Secretary Rice. I, as the American Secretary of State, will be there. I will be at the table to lead the American delegation, and any issue that Iran wishes to discuss, not just the nuclear issue, will be on the agenda. And Iran has turned us down. Why? I think one reason why is that Iran is not at all monolithic. It is a government riven by various factions of different ideologies and different ways of looking at the world. And I think one possible explanation is that they simply can't arrive at a decision to respond to this offer that the P5 have made. My sense is that the Ahmadinejad faction of the government, quite radical in nature, in the way they think about us, it just doesn't see it in its interest to come to the table with the United States, especially with the United States at this point in time, and they'd rather carry through with this acceleration of their nuclear research. And so we're at an interesting juncture. Iran essentially has said no for 2 years to that first path. What is the second path? The second path is sanctions. In the last 2 years, we have been able to engineer these same countries, the PERM 5 countries, 4 UN Security Council sanctions resolutions, 3 of which are Chapter 7, thus obligatory sanctions resolutions. And so now we have the extraordinary spectacle of Iran, of 192 countries in the world, Iran is one of 10, being sanctioned by the United Nations. All of Iran's non-aligned brethren, India and Pakistan and Indonesia and Brazil and Egypt, are implementing UN sanctions against Iran. That's the first wave of sanctions. The second is we've tried to work through the European Union and the other major trade partners of Iran to say, can you please not do business as usual? Can you diminish your economic dealings with Iran as a way to strengthen this pressure on the Iranians? We've had some success. Certainly the European Union countries, I think, are just about, in the next 2 or 3 weeks, to pass a sanctions resolution against Iran, which will be doubly tough than the UN one. But we haven't had as much success with the other trading partners in Asia, South Korea and Japan, or in the Gulf, the Emirates, Bahrain and Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. And that's where the next phase of the sanctions diplomacy needs to go. The other instrument, which has frankly been the most effective, has been the private sector, private banks, and lending institutions. Because of the reputational risk that comes along with sanctions, under Chapter 7, we've begun to see bank after bank in Germany, France, and France at the direction of President Sarkozy, in Britain, and in other countries say, we're no longer going to lend to Iran, or we're going to dramatically decrease the amount of money available to our own companies to trade with Iran. And I think the Iranians have feared that the most and have felt the pinch from that the most. As we look to the future, with Iran saying no to the negotiations and Iran speeding ahead along the nuclear continuum, we've got to hope that this sanctions policy is going to work. Because if it doesn't work, it's going to leave a future American president with a vastly diminished array of options. And I still believe that if there's time, and there is time, we ought to use every ounce of creativity in our diplomatic arsenal to see if there's a way to bring Iran to the table, because that's the only way that I can figure out to end this in a peaceful way, and that should be the hope of every American. We should never want to use military force or go to war unless it is absolutely necessary. And this is a rather large threat to future American security interests in the Middle East. But I think that we should stay on this diplomatic continuum, hope that those people around the world who want to see diplomacy succeed will begin to make some sacrifices about their bottom line. China is a country that often tells us, please don't use force, please work with us diplomatically. And we say to the Chinese, you're the #1 trade partner of Iran. You've become the #1 trade partner by essentially taking all the investment opportunities that the Europeans give up. Please, China, think of your foreign policy not just from a mercantilist point of view, but from a global strategic point of view. And the same will be true of all the other countries that have a heavy trading relationship with Iran. I think that's where the diplomacy needs to now to be accented in the period ahead. My final point would be this. As we watch the diplomacy proceed over the next year or two, as we hope for a peaceful resolution of this dispute, and I hope for it, there is something that individual Americans can do, that universities can do, that nonprofit institutions can do, and that is to, in essence, if our government can't break down the barrier in relations with Iran, American citizens can. We have the most unusual diplomatic relationship with Iran of any country in the world. Think of it this way. We talk to Cuba. We have a liaison office there. We have an embassy in Caracas. We have an embassy in Rangoon. We have an embassy in Harare. We talk to governments that we don't like all the time. We don't talk to Iran. There hasn't been a single purposeful, strategic, continuous discussion between the two governments since 1978-79. So until we can get to the point that we're beginning to talk to each other, and we're not there yet, clearly, there is an opportunity for American citizens to begin to demystify America for Iran and vice versa. And the Congress has been very generous with us. Our suggestion back in 2005 was, please give us some money, this is to the Congress, to help fund people-to-people exchanges. We once had tens of thousands of Iranians in American universities back in the 60s and 70s. We now have about 2,000 Iranian university students in the United States. Shouldn't we want to multiply that, double it, triple it, quadruple that number with the leading adversary of the United States in the world? Shouldn't we want younger Iranians to have a chance to understand our society and Americans to study in Iran? Shouldn't we be bringing their health practitioners and artists and disaster response experts, as we have, in greater numbers to the United States so that we can begin to break down these artificial barriers that have separated us from them for nearly 3 decades? I think that's one thing that universities and the civil society sector of the United States can do with the help of the Congress. And Congress, I think, is willing to fund this until such time that our two governments can begin to sit across from each other and deal with these very significant problems that we have. So thank you for listening to what is admittedly a quite general and superficial overview of an incredibly difficult problem. But I want to share those thoughts with you, ask for any ideas that you have or just questions you want to ask for me on this topic or any other. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Burns is now available to answer questions on any topic, and let me remind you what the system is here. There are 4 microphones which you can approach if you have a question. I'll recognize each questioner in turn. I'd ask all questioners to identify themselves, number 1. Number 2, these are the standard rules, you've heard them before, ask one question, count them, one question. And third, a question can be identified by, it has an implied query, there's a little inflection of the voice at the end, a question mark at the end. So those are our 3 rules. I want to give an opportunity, I want to ask a question myself of Nick, and I want to give an opportunity to Graham Allison to ask a question for 2 reasons. First of all, he knows a lot about this subject and has worked on this issue for a while, but it just so happens that Graham was in Iran not long ago. Nick was talking about the value of informal contacts. We do a lot of that at the Kennedy School here. I do it, Graham does it. I see Steve Bosworth here, the dean of the Fletcher School. And Graham's had an opportunity to go, and that may have occasioned a question in his mind, so I'm going to give him the first turn. My question for you, Nick, is this. You said that everybody in the world saw that North Korea was determined to get nuclear weapons. Yet we saw the spectacle a few months ago of the United States government itself seeming to say the opposite in this national intelligence estimate released at the end of 2007. And for those of you who don't know, this was whatever you think we ought to do with Iran, whether you think we ought to bomb them or talk to them, this was a torpedo amidships to you and your policy, because it gave many around the world to believe that it wasn't as bad as we were saying it was. Can you explain whether that's, I actually don't think it's true, I don't think that's what it said, but how can a government shoot itself in the foot?
Well, thanks for that softball, Ash, I really appreciate it. What I can say is this. We did publish, as a government, an unclassified national intelligence estimate. I suppose that most of you read it or read the news accounts of it. And it was interesting because it focused on one issue in the executive summary as it was published to the newspapers and to the public. It focused on nuclear weapons development program. And it essentially said that our intelligence estimate was that the Iranians had stopped that program in 2003. But the straightest avenue towards a nuclear weapons capability is not weaponization, and the most difficult is not weaponization. It's the enrichment and reprocessing. And what that report also said, and it's interesting, you know, when you study how journalists write stories, I'm not trying to criticize any journalists who are here today, like my friend David Greenaway, I know he would never do this. But a lot of the reporters just didn't focus on the second part of the NIE, which said Iran is actually accelerating its efforts on enrichment and reprocessing. Why did the UN Security Council sanction Iran in July 06, December 06, March 07, all before this NIE report came out? They never said anything about weaponization. It was all about enrichment and reprocessing. Why did the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors twice pass resolutions against Iran? It was not on weaponization. It was on enrichment and reprocessing. So we did not do a brilliant job, frankly, in the United States government in those days of saying publicly, the real issue here is their scientific research and development. That's the critical issue. That's what needed to be stopped. And it was simply one of those cases where everyone focused over here when we probably should have been focusing over there, and our government bears some responsibility in the public diplomacy, press explanation of this, for not really bringing that out as the salient factor in our judgment when we look at this question of Iran's nuclear weapons future.
Graham, you want to come on up? I'll just say that we do spend $40 billion for our intelligence, and it's one thing if it's not right, but when it undercuts us, it bothers me. You don't need to say anything about that.
Graham.
We should get our money back, yes. Nick, earlier today you were talking about Iran and how much we understand about the internal workings of Iran or don't. So that's where my question wants to go. One of the exercises we play here at the school from time to time is red teaming Iran. So you try to put yourself in their shoes and imagine, how do they look at the situation? How do they see the situation? And one of our colleagues, Steve Miller, has become so adept at this that we have labeled him Mullah Miller, since he gives a more plausible account of their actions and their thinking than their diplomats do. So when I listen to the Iranians, they have a narrative, which you've certainly heard, which says, we're a small country, you're a big country. You, in the Bush administration, announced, well, first, you were attacked at 9/11. You said you were going to topple the Taliban. We actually helped you in Afghanistan. Then you said you were going to try to reestablish a government there. We actually helped you considerably in that period, in the end of '01. Then there was this axis of evil speech at the State of the Union in 2002, in which you said, we're an evil regime. The treatment for evil regimes is to topple them, to have regime change. And then you went about and you attacked these guys in Iraq, and you toppled them. And many people were wearing T-shirts saying, real men want to go to Tehran. So we've been nervous about that. And therefore, and then the story goes on. So the question is, if you try to put yourself in the Iranian position and try to think about that from their perspective, being terrified about what they see as a superpower that's toppled one country that now has troops on both sides of them, that actually from time to time talks about regime change, and now looks at their, quote, civilian nuclear program, which I agree with you about. So they've got a narrative. So the question is, how do you think about their narrative? And secondly, how well or how poorly are we understanding what's actually going on inside Iran?
Well, Graham, I think you've asked a really important question, and you're right that the real tragedy of U.S.-Iran relations going back to 78, 79 is that each of us has a history and a mythology that's grown up around this relationship, and neither of us understand each other. If I had to choose one country in the world, one country that we know far too little about, it's Iran. We haven't had diplomats there since the hostages were returned on January 20th, 1981, when President Reagan took office. We don't have any American journalists based in Iran because the Iranians won't let that happen. Sometimes people go in at 2s and 3s. We don't have an American business community in Iran. So the normal way that we learn as a country about another country, that had disappeared nearly 30 years ago. When Secretary Rice became Secretary of State, she asked me to take on the Iran portfolio, and she said, let me know what our resources are. And I reported back to her, I'll never forget this, saying we have 0.5 people working on this issue. We had one guy spending part of his time, Henry Wooster, a very fine American diplomat, part of his time on Iran. And she said, we got to do a lot better, and DOD made the same calculation. So we now have an Iran desk of 10 people, which in the State Department, a very small department, is a large number of people. We decided that we'd take a page from our playbook from the 1920s, and this is why diplomatic history is so important. And we decided to set up our version of the Riga Station in Abu Dhabi. Riga Station was established in Riga by the United States State Department in the 1920s, and we didn't have diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union until FDR recognized the Soviet Union in 1933. We sent young diplomats like Chip Bolin and George Kennan out to Latvia to learn Russian and to be a window into the Soviet Union because we didn't have anybody there at the time. So we decided if we cannot establish an American embassy in Tehran, and we couldn't in 2005 and still haven't, we can at least get as close as possible. Tell 6 people, 6 diplomats, your job is to understand Iran. Your job is to talk to Iranians. Your job is to read the Iranian press. Your job is to understand Iran for the U.S. government. And we've done that. And we've put American diplomats in Kabul and in Baghdad and in other places where the Iranians have influence and said, your job, you, is to be the Iran watcher in that embassy. So we've built up a rudimentary capacity in the State Department. DOD has done the same thing. Other agencies of the government have, to understand this country, which is now one of the major adversaries of our government, but we know too little about it. And I think whether it's on the nuclear issue or the issue of Iranian support for terrorism, one of the difficulties as a policymaker is just to have a basic understanding of what motivates this other government. Because Graham's right. One of the things that you have to do in government is get out of your own shoes and try to put yourself in the shoes of the person across the divide. And it's relatively easier to do when you have eyes and ears on the ground, which we do not have in Tehran or in any other city in Iran. So I think it is one of the remaining challenges. And as I've gone around to universities in the United States, I've been impressed by how little many of our major American universities focus on Iran or have substantial programs devoted to that part of the Middle East. And so just another suggestion for the higher education sector in our own country.
My name is Steve Stepak. I'm a teacher in Cambridge. Given your remarks that Russia and China may be allies or close friends of Iran, I'm very nervous about the talk that's already occurred that going to war with Iran is an option. What do you think about this option?
Thank you. I said in my remarks that I felt we were right, President Bush was right, to keep the military option on the table. I say that for one reason. That's not our preferred option. We should do everything that we can to avoid having to use military force. And we should be creative and aggressive in our diplomacy in order to find our way to the negotiating table. But it is certainly not in the national interest of the United States to see Iran achieve, this particular Iranian government, of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a nuclear weapons capability. Think of the implications for the balance of power in the Middle East. That is so important to our country. Think of the implications for Israel. Most Israelis see this as the existential threat to them. Think of the implications for all of our friends in the Gulf and the other moderate Arab countries that are so important to the future of our country. So I think if you size up what the strategic disadvantages of a nuclear-armed Iran, it wouldn't make much sense to me in a region that values and understands and sometimes appreciates strength to essentially take one of the major points of leverage of the United States out of the equation. I think we're right, and the President is certainly right, to keep that as a potential option. But you know my views, that a diplomatic solution is possible. There is no inevitability about a war or conflict with Iran, in my judgment. And given what we've just gone through in Iraq and Afghanistan, knowing how difficult it is to prosecute an asymmetric war, we should think long and hard about strengthening our diplomacy first as the primary American strategy. And that's what the strategy of our government has been for the last 3 years, since February, March of 2005. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Arash. I'm Iranian student here in second year. My question is that what do you think is the true purpose of the Iranian nuclear program? Is it really to get a nuclear war as fast as possible? Or is it to keep the United States as long as possible as the enemy of the Iranian people for only domestic political purpose?
Well, thank you very much for your question. I'm glad to see you here today. And you may be able to answer the question better than I can, because it has to do with understanding what motivates the current Iranian regime. I find one of the great ironies in dealing with Iran the fact that in public opinion poll after poll, the most positive people in the Middle East about America, putting Israelis aside, are Iranians, about American society. And it's encouraging for us to see that despite the estrangement of the last nearly 30 years, so many Iranians still have a positive view of our country, of our society. And so it seems to me we ought to build on that. And that's why we've suggested a vastly expanded people-to-people exchange between Iranians and Americans, so at least we begin to get to know each other. And I'm happy to see you here today in that regard. I can't read the minds of Ahmadinejad and of Motaki and of Jalili or Larijani or the supreme leader of Iran. But I hope the Iranians know that it's in our publicly expressed interest to have a chance to have a strategic dialogue. Now, we've established one narrow channel in Baghdad. Our ambassador has the authorization to sit down with the Iranian ambassador to Iraq. The Iranians have canceled more meetings that have been held, unfortunately. We're pretty much ready on a continual basis to have these discussions, but the Iranian government has been very ambivalent about it, and that's a shame. We've tried to establish this second channel through Russia and China and the Europeans with the Americans, sitting down with the Iranians, and the Iranians have said no to that. The reason I accentuate that point is because the conventional press spin in the United States is the Bush administration doesn't want negotiations and Iran does. Actually, I think the reality is quite the reverse. I've experienced it over the last 3 years, so I do hope there's a change of heart. But I imagine that the political rivalries and divisions in Iran are a large part of the reason for why there's so much ambivalence on the part of the Iranian government itself about sitting down with us. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, Secretary Burns. My name is Ronak Desai. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. My question is about the United States, Iran, and India, actually. During negotiations for the U.S.-India nuclear deal, in which you obviously played a central role, India's ties with Iran loomed very large over the negotiations, so much so that Congress actually inserted a clause in the Hyde Act addressing the situation. Given India's unique position with regards to its relationship with the United States and Iran, and I guess by proxy Israel, from an American policy perspective, does India at some point have a role to play in addressing Iran's nuclear program? And I guess the second part of my question is, given India's continued cooperation with Iran in the energy and strategic sectors, will this at some point detrimentally impact the U.S.-India strategic relationship in the long run?
I think it's a really good question. It has not received a lot of press attention here, but you're right to ask it, because I would say that the greatest strategic advance we've made as a country in the last 4 or 5 years, I go broader than that, the last decade or so, has been our new relationship with India. It was begun by President Clinton. He's the one who made the opening with the BJP party. It's been continued, and here the baton was passed very cleanly between the two administrations, Clinton and Bush. It's been continued by President Bush, who's actually put more into it, more effort, I think, and ambition into it, with the Congress party. So the great strength of this relationship is you've got the two major political parties in each country supporting a new strategic, economic, scientific, political partnership between India and the States. There is enormous promise here, and we've got to try to realize it. When we were testifying, Secretary Rice and I, 2 years ago before the Congress on the India civil nuclear deal, one of the questions that some members asked is, shouldn't we essentially ask India, if it's going to be our new strategic partner and get the benefit of a civil nuclear deal with the U.S., to downgrade its relationship with Iran? And our answer at the time was, we certainly would not want India in any way, shape, or form to aid or assist the development of Iranian nuclear program. And the analytical answer to that is they have not been. India is a country that's safeguarded its nuclear technology, and that's why we believe that India should return as a full member of the non-proliferation community and be delivered of its nuclear isolation. We also said, let's not try to grade India on a different scale from the grades that we give to our European allies, or to Japan, or to South Korea. All of our allies have diplomatic relations with Iran. All of them have ambassadors in Tehran. Most of them trade with Iran. And you shouldn't be asking India to go to a zero engagement policy with Iran if you're not asking the same of the United Kingdom or France or Japan or South Korea. And I think India probably has, there's no question in terms of the military, program, really no relations with Iran to speak of beyond some symbolic ship visits. And on the political and economic side, India is shying away from a tripartite agreement on a gas pipeline, Pakistan, Iran, and India. The Indian minister has failed to attend the last two meetings, so I think the Indians have behaved appropriately. I don't think that one reason people should oppose the civil nuclear deal, and they're wrong to do it in my judgment, should be because India has acted in a way that's improper with Iran. The facts don't support that case.
Hi, my name is Anna Weisweiler, and I'm a graduate student at the Extension School. I was wondering if you could speak to what role you see Russia playing in the coming decades, especially in dealing with terrorism and global terrorism and state sponsors of terrorism such as Iran.
Well, I do think we've got a very complicated relationship with Russia at the present time. And I wouldn't want to prejudge the actions and attitudes of the new Russian president. But I would expect, as President Putin will be part of this new government as well, that we will see a continuation of some of the difficult issues that are coming to the fore in our relationship. Certainly, the centralization of power in the Kremlin. Certainly, what we see is declining respect for press freedoms and political freedoms within Russia itself. Certainly, the aggressive attitude towards countries that we believe should be free of coercion, countries like Moldova, Georgia, and the Baltic countries that are now NATO members and NATO allies of the United States. So we got some problems with Russia. But on the other hand, and I was happy you mentioned terrorism, we have some connecting points with Russia, and so we need to keep a balanced view about the Russians. Russia, arguably, is the most important counterterrorism partner that the United States has on a global basis. Russia, on proliferation, in the case of North Korea and Iran, has been a very fine strategic partner. And in Iran, I was speaking earlier today to some of the faculty here, I think Russia has a very clear strategic view that it does not want Iran to become a nuclear weapons power. Russia has acted on that. Russia has been, I think, the intellectual godfather of most of the P5 strategy. The basic idea of trying to build a civil nuclear energy consortium but not give Iran access to the fuel cycle came from President Putin, and we were happy to embrace that and support it. So there's a lot of business the United States can do with Russia, and because of Russia's proximity to Iran geographically, and because of the history between those two, and because Russia's clear national interest is to see a limit on the number of nuclear powers that emerge in the world, particularly in the Middle East, I think Russia will be a good partner of the United States, and we ought to stick close to Russia. And we wouldn't have had these 4 Security Council resolutions without this close U.S.-Russian involvement over the last 3 years. Thank you.
I'm tremendously impressed with most of your remarks, and in reading that you speak Arabic. I wish there were more of our diplomats and government leaders along with other languages. I salute you. I was going to ask you a question about why you did not include world poverty in your list of 5 or 6 major national issues, and how we put almost all of our foreign aid into military. But I'm told I have only one question, so I want to ask about Iran. My question on Iran is, why do you and other speakers in either party coming out of Washington, one, not educate the American people that in the 1950s, our country, my government, invaded Iran and overthrew a democratically elected government and left a dictator behind, and that's part of the legacy there. And my other question is, why do you and every other speaker that I ever hear in either party assume that the Middle East is American turf? That we are the legitimate major power in the Middle East, instead of Iran or Syria, or a combination of Iran and Syria and Lebanon, et cetera.
Okay. Mossadegh and U.S. role in the Middle East.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your questions, and thanks for your comments. I think the problem is, and I'm going to try to say this very objectively, is we've got too much history in the U.S.-Iran relationship, and too much of it is negative. Now, I've heard the Iranian litany before, and of Mossadegh. We didn't invade Iran in 1953, but I've heard the Iranian complaints, the list of complaints. We've got our list too. I mean, I can do that. I can play that game too. We had 52 of my colleagues, 2 of whom are still serving in the State Department, taken hostage in November 4th, 1979, held for 444 days. We believe that Iran and Hezbollah were behind the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut, where 240 Marines were killed in October '83. Behind the bombing of the American embassy in Beirut in that same autumn of 1983. We know Iran's been behind Hezbollah that has captured and murdered American citizens in the 80s and 90s. And so if we play that game, then we're going to estrange ourselves even further from each other. And I think as a diplomat that our challenge is to say, we've got all this history behind us. We need to study it, understand it, and recognize it. We can't wipe it away. But if you focus just on the past, we're going to go nowhere, the two of us, around the United States. And our task is, with an extraordinarily difficult government in Tehran, find a way to influence them. Find a way to sit down and talk to them at the negotiating table. That's what our Secretary of State, Condi Rice, has been trying to do since February 11th, 2005. That's the day she announced the change in American policy. We would support negotiations. We would involve ourselves in that effort. We had spurned that between 2001 and early 2005. So I wouldn't face backward. I'd face forward. I'd look at the huge stakes for Iran and the United States if this hits a brick wall, which I don't want to have happen, and I know you don't from the basis of your question, and leave the history to somebody else. That's my recommendation. Thank you.
I'm Moheb Ali. I'm a mid-career student at Kennedy School. Thank you, Ambassador Burns, for your talk. The theme that came out is that you really want to talk to Iran to bring them to negotiating table. And a couple of things, time is on our side as of now. It might run out soon. And then one of the offers that you put on the table, which was unfortunately refused by Iran. And the way I understood it is they refused it on the grounds that there is precondition attached, that you need to stop the uranium processing or whatever that is, and then we can come to the table. Now, also you said that Ahmadinejad's regime is more hostile, and if it was Khatami, it would have been a different party there who could be more receptive. Now, my question to you is, do you think having time on our side, and if we remove this precondition which they are using to not come to the table, and really to put them on the back foot, and go into the negotiations with a date set in mind that for a few days we will talk to see how things move, and then we'll stop, because the downside is maybe they'll keep enriching and there will be a dialogue going on and it could be detrimental to United States. But can we not get creative and change our, instead of getting caught up in, okay, you come and there is a precondition, because the objective is to come to the negotiation, bring them to the negotiating table, have a face-to-face dialogue, that will not be, you think, a better option, or we might be then at the end of the game, time will be lost, and then we might think, okay, let's talk without any preconditions. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think you've asked a really important question about the tactics of this whole issue, this conundrum of how we get to negotiations. And I just say two things very quickly. First of all, we do have time, but it's not unlimited. If Iran, and I'm just relying on Dr. Alberti and the IEA, if Iran continues on its present course, it's not going to be a long time before they become nuclear capable. So we've got to keep our eyes on that clock. Second, you ask a very important question, and we've often been criticized in this administration for having said to the Iranians, we'll talk to you on the condition that you suspend your enrichment program at Natanz. Why have we done that, insisted on that? And by the way, that's the Russian, Chinese, and European condition too. It's our group condition for two reasons. First, we didn't want to get into a negotiation where we were negotiating and the Iranians were happily continuing to build their nuclear capacity. Second, it gets back to our understanding, perhaps our lack of understanding of who they are and what motivates them. This would be a major card to play by the P5 and the United States. We'll talk to you without any conditions. We'll let you continue to engage in nuclear research at Natanz. And if you were going to play that card, you'd want to have a reasonable expectation that that would be reciprocated, and we don't have that. There hasn't been a single signal from the Ahmadinejad government since its inauguration in late August of 2005 that it's interested in negotiations or that it might even consider slowing down its nuclear effort. Not a single one. mean, time after time, all these, President Putin was in Tehran in October, and Javier Solana countless times, and yet they've never given any indication that they're interested in negotiations. So you have to play these cards, the few that you have, rather carefully, judiciously. And what's been in our minds is, it's not time yet. They haven't given us any signals back that they're interested. So for those two reasons, we've maintained the condition. We've been right to do it. I've supported this personally until, as in my job as undersecretary. I thought that was the thing to do. But we'll face a time of transition in this problem, where we're going to have to step back and look at it in its full dimension and ask whether the present policy is succeeding, whether it's not. And I hope we will always be able to say in the next year or two that there is a diplomatic way forward. This is a two-way street. It's not just up to the United States and Russia and China to figure out creative ways forward. It's up to the Iranians. We see no signal from them that they're trying to be equally creative as we are. And I think that's the ball's in their court, if you know what I mean on that one.
And my name's Simon Wilson. I'm a Nieman Journalism Fellow at Harvard, and when I'm not here, I work as a journalist for the BBC. I wanted to pick up on your comments, which I thought were very interesting, about the need for an enhanced civil service for the United States, with it externally focused to take over where the military leaves off. And what I'm really interested in is how that would be different from how Britain and other powers operated an imperial policy, where we would use our military power to intervene somewhere in the world in an area where we had an interest, to install or encourage the installation of leaders favorable to us, and then send in a civil service to run the bureaucracy. Is there a risk of America becoming the empire of its day?
Thank you for that very interesting and provocative question. We Americans like to think that we're not an empire. I'm an Irish American, so my grandparents were decidedly against empire, having been born into one. And I think that it's very important that foreigners like you understand that we're not an empire, but we're a global power in a globalized world. And so it's in our national interests to play on every stage in the world. And the problem that we've got right now is that we've got this magnificent, fully funded, powerful military. We're all proud of it. I'll bet everybody in this room is a relative in the military. I have a nephew who served twice in Iraq, so we're all proud of the military. We have a diplomatic apparatus that can't match it in terms of its weight. So Secretary Rice went to the Congress about a month ago and said, please give us the funding to hire 1,100 new diplomats. Give us the funding to hire 300 new USAID officers. We used to have, I think at the height of the Vietnam War, 13,000 USAID personnel. We're now down to about 1,200. And so we simply don't have the capacity, given the diplomatic surge we've had to make in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, places like that, to be fully staffed around the world. I don't see a lot of countries asking us to shrink from our responsibilities or to pull back. I see countries in Latin America who want free trade agreements, and countries in Africa that want global HIV, AIDS, and malaria programs, and countries like Iraq and Colombia who want effective counter-narcotics assistance, and countries like Afghanistan who want road building and hospital construction and school construction. You can't do that unless you have people who can actually go and administer those projects, conceive of them, administer them, run them, and see that they're successful. And we're simply too short-handed in our government. When you have more musicians in the US government than diplomats, you know there's a problem. So I'm making an argument, and more importantly, the President and Secretary Rice are making an argument, which I hope will be supported by all the presidential candidates, that the Congress in 2009 should think about a surge in support for the civil side of our foreign policy.
I'm afraid we have time for just one more question. I'm sorry, and it'll be this gentleman.
Oh dear, the pressure's on.
We could go on all night with Dick, but he can't. We do need to wrap up.
Good evening, sir. My name is Naveed Malik. I'm a grad student here in Professor Allison and O'Sullivan's course, so I hope this isn't a rudimentary question.
Because you're in that course, or just because?
Well, my dock my grade. Well, you'd mentioned Israel, and clearly, Iran's nuclear ambitions are a greater threat to Israel. Reasonably, you could argue that their appetite for preventive or preemptive attack would be greater and in a shorter timeline. So could you just sort of chart the U.S.-Israeli diplomatic relationship? Where do they stand, and how do you control or to whatever degree influence, their readiness to attack at what point, and how does America react if that happens?
Thank you. It's a really good question, and it's actually something that I should have mentioned, and thank you for reminding me, because part of this whole drama and part of the diplomatic equation is Israel. Put yourself, a lot of people want us to put ourselves in Iran's shoes to understand what motivates them. Put yourself in Israel's shoes. Here's a country that's nearly 60 years old and hasn't had a single day of peace in 60 years, right? Has fought all sorts of wars against most of its neighbors, that has an internal problem that is truly daunting in the future of the Palestinian population. There comes along an Iranian president who says twice in important international meetings, Israel should be wiped off the map of the world. He said it. He said it. And now the Iranian government has to go around trying to explain why he said it and what he meant and what he didn't mean. The same president said the Holocaust, consistently has said the Holocaust never happened, and has sponsored a conference in Tehran to that effect. If you're an Israeli citizen or government official, given the history of the Jewish people, you can't disregard statements by leaders of aggressive countries who want to become nuclear weapons powers. So I have absolute sympathy with the Israelis in looking at this strategic equation. One of my responsibilities I had was to chair the U.S.-Israel strategic dialogue for the U.S. side. And I can tell you, the Israelis have thought about this problem. They are singularly focused on it. They should be. And I know that the Israelis want us to succeed in our diplomacy and are trying to help us succeed in our diplomacy. One of the things the Iranians need to understand is that careless, really aggressive and irresponsible statements have consequences, and people do listen to them. So I hope, again, that this can all be resolved peacefully. But one of the greatest disadvantages of a nuclear-armed Iran of the United States will be that our leading ally in the Middle East, Israel, and partner, will be at a huge strategic disadvantage should the Iranians gain that capability. And so I think it's something we all got to watch, and another reason to hope for peace and a peaceful resolution of this particular problem.
Nick, I've listened to a lot of military music, and I don't want anything that is done at the State Department to be at the expense of military music, which I think could use great improvement also. But you've addressed the quantitative side of the State Department, and I'd just like to say that listening to Nick and knowing him as long as I have, I don't know how good these people are that you're going to hire, but I'd trade 100 of them if you would have stayed in. I'm sorry to see you go. I think you get some idea of what we're missing, taxpayers who are that part of the audience which is American and paying their taxes. But it's been our gain here tonight at Harvard. Nick, thank you so much for spending the evening with us.
Thank you very much.
That was terrific. Absolutely. And you'll get a costume.